Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming to this little workshop on getting started on job search ads and how to start applying for positions in teaching academia. I'm Katie DeVeau. I work in the Anatomy and Regenerative Biology department, whose name will be changing in a little bit. But I am just within my first year working for GW, so I'm fresh out of my PhD. I finished that in May of last year, so I'm like super green, but knowledgeable.
I know where some of you might be too.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah.
I hopefully will bring a good perspective for you guys on how to like get the ball rolling and start looking for jobs and gathering everything you need for the jobs, and then finally applying. And
My name is Kirsten Brown. I'm a faculty member at GW since 2011. I was the chair of the committee that hired Katie. So I have experience in terms of both applying for jobs and then also running search committees and kind of the whole breadth of the experiences. We are both educators by training, so we are teaching intensive positions. I know you guys are doing a bunch of different seminars on postdoc opportunities, and you'll do research positions, and you'll look at policy and public speaking and those type of options. So this is just one of the things you can do when you finish your PhD. This is still kind of in that ivory tower of academia though, right? So you're not really going outside the ivory tower, but it's just a different set of options. So we just kind of want to give you guys an introduction, as Katie was saying, to like what when you think of a teaching intensive career, what does that mean in terms of our responsibilities day to day? What does that mean for our promotion and our professional development? And is that something that you potentially may be interested in as you're finishing your PhDs or as you're finishing a postdoc?
So I thought it might be a good idea for us to go ahead and kind of like share where we are in our training and how far along we are in like looking. So if you all don't mind sharing, like where are we at with the whole job search thing and starting to look for
Year, program, postdoc.
How far away are we?
This is supposed to be interactive.
Yeah.
So.
We're very much like, talk to us. Anyone? On you on the front.
I'm Sarah, and I'm a postdoc. I've only been here for about 6 months now, but my contract is only officially for 2 years, so I already have to start looking again, either for another postdoc or for a job.
Right.
Anyone else?
Well, I'm just going to go all the way back. Yep.
Hi, I'm Lei. I'm postdoc of Lab. I've been here about 1 year. And,
okay.
Yeah, I come from China. Maybe find a teacher job in China after maybe 3 or 5 years.
Good. Good.
And I'm Madis, and I'm a PhD student, and I will graduate at the end of this year from SEAS, actually, a School of Engineering and Applied Science.
Oh, so
Yeah.
you're from across the other side of campus. Gotcha. Welcome to this hall.
Thank you.
So you're right on the job market train. Cool.
I'm Lalita, and I'm a postdoc. I have been here for the past 6 months. So yeah, I just would like to improve my communication skills, and teaching is a really good option because what we learn when we are able to communicate in a better way, that's when we can make, give value to what we have learned.
Mhm.
So yeah.
What you learn in a PhD is not how to teach, by the way, unless you actually did a PhD in teaching. Everything I learned on the job. So it's a totally different skill set in order to hone that. Okay.
Hi, I'm Chauncey. I was a postdoc, and now I'm a research scientist. I also teach for the PhD grad students here in the Econ department. Yep.
Cool.
Hi, I'm Jimmy. I'm a third-year PhD student.
We're just gonna snake back. Yep.
Hi, I'm Pan. I'm a postdoc in lab. I'm from the same
Mhm.
and I can be here for half a year, and I want to have do some research later in college as a teacher.
Interesting. Okay.
So currently, I just graduated from a master's degree. I'm working as a research assistant in the same lab as her. So to be honest with you, I compared for the food, but
There's no shame in admitting that. And there will be food. It is running late though. We're not going to starve you guys to listen to me talk.
It's okay. I can.
Maybe you'll come away with something though. Okay.
Sure, at this point.
Okay.
I am Satish. I'm a third year postdoc, but this is my 6th month at GWU.
Okay.
So I'm doing research, but I'm still curious on what is.
See what the opportunities are. Right.
I'm DeVeau, and I've been in GW for almost 2 years, and this is my first postdoc as such, but I have got a little bit of exposure of teaching, mentoring to the students, and also in my grad school where we had little sessions for junior students. And I'm weighing different options for careers and would like to see if teaching is a good fit for me. So thank you for holding the session.
Oh, thank you. Thank you to Dean Hall and everyone for organizing. Yes.
Hi, I'm Eden. I'm a third year PhD student and I'm potentially interested in pursuing a career in teaching.
Wow.
Hi, I'm Derek. I'm a postdoc in a rheumatology lab. I'm coming up on my first year here. I'm not currently looking for a job, but I'm keeping an open mind.
Do you work with Vicky?
I do.
She's my co-block director in MSK block, so
Oh,
she
okay.
can tell her that you know Kirsten.
Will do.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Yasin Nobu. I'm a postdoc here for 2 years. I'm looking for a job. I'm teaching in one of my I'm looking for research.
Keep a wide net.
I'm Sophia, I'm a second year postdoc. After my PhD, I taught for 1 year in grads and master's students in India back in India. But after here, so I really want to explore options here.
Before we get the pizza, just a real quick question. How many of you guys have actually had some teaching opportunities here or elsewhere? Either not, it could be anything. It could be in the lab, it could be a full class, it could be a lecture, it could be small group sessions. Okay, it's kind of mixed. Okay, cool. So we're just go ahead and do pizza.
Yeah.
Why don't y'all just go ahead and get fed? We'll take a time out and then we'll dive into some of the other stuff as we get going. We're not. So teaching jobs, we live and die by learning objectives. So that's one thing that will beat into your head. And so what our objectives for at the end of this session, we're going to describe the faculty breakdown for teaching focused faculty positions. So what does that look like in terms of our commitments, our percent efforts? We're going to discuss the overall teaching dossier, also known as a teaching portfolio. So when you're applying for teaching intensive jobs, the requirements that you're going to need are different than say applying to a postdoc or applying to a research position. So we're going to go over a few of these. And then we're also going to discuss the qualifications you need in order to sell yourself to apply for these types of jobs.
And as Kirsten was saying, when we talk about the teaching dossier, it's a lot bigger than what we're going to focus on specifically today. We really wanted to break it down into the 3 things that are pretty prominent for teaching, or like teaching faculty positions rather than just research. There are a few that kind of overlap the two, like a CV, but we're not going to talk about how to develop those. Hopefully there'll be other places you guys can talk about that, how to develop CVs. So before we begin delving into our learning objectives, there are a couple questions that I want everyone to start thinking about. And that's, where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years? And I know that seems like, oh my gosh, 5 to 10 years, maybe you haven't even thought of it, that's fine. But this is something that my PI would always sit down and be like, Katie, where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years? What do you want to be doing? Do you want to be running a lab? Do you want to be having a lot of student contact hours? Do you want to be standing in front of students giving workshops? Stuff like that. Do you want to have a big component in students' education, or do you want to be writing grants all the time and running a basic science lab? Has anyone thought about where they see themselves in like 5 years out?
Besides employed generally.
Yeah.
That's usually the goal. That was my goal when I finished, was just to have a job.
And then does anyone know that they want to go into teaching? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like I want to be at a university or college that has kind of that values both teaching and research.
Right, so you bring up a great point, because you said you want to be at a college or university that values both. So depending on the type of institution you want to work at will really dictate where your responsibilities lie, like how much portion of the research you'll have versus how much teaching you'll have, or your overall responsibilities. So that's something you really need to start thinking about. For instance, I had my undergraduate education at a small liberal arts school, right? So those faculty members, they were like strictly teaching, and they had, funsies, little research over the summer. But it was a teaching heavy workload.
And that will look differently if you guys are at maybe a health science institution like George Washington School of Medicine and Health Science, or if you're at the NIH. So there are very different ways at which you can look at types of teaching jobs. So the institution that you want to end up with matters just as much as kind of your overall breakdown. So these are some things to consider.
So we also want to start thinking about like what kind of language do I look for in an advertisement that lets me know that it will be teaching heavy career. And then what do search committees look for? Do we even know what a search committee is? We'll talk about that a little bit. And then how does your teaching portfolio highlight your strengths? And we'll talk about how to start doing this. We are by no means going to be able to cover all of this. It's very large. We'll talk about a few documents that you can submit in your job application to help make you look great.
And I'll tell you, if you're feeling overwhelmed, we were working on this session and I started to get overwhelmed because I have to go for promotion this year. So I will be preparing my teaching dossier and my portfolio, and it is like hives that I want to think about everything that you have to put into it. It's not that it's not there, it's just that when you start to actually document everything, it's overwhelming, and that's totally normal for anybody that's thinking about any part of this whole process, no matter how far you've been in a faculty position or where you are in that whole process.
So like my mom always said, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So although it seems like a very large thing, you just do it one step at a time. Just a little step. Okay, like we were saying a little bit earlier, the institution type that you'll be working at will help dictate your faculty responsibility breakdown. So for instance, at a top tier research university, so like a very large university like GW, your teaching load per semester might look a little different than it would at like a community college, right? So these numbers might not make a lot of sense to you, but it's really the courses that you'll be in charge of per semester. So for instance, in this 1-2 or 1-1, you would be in charge of like one course in the spring and 2 in the fall, correct? Yeah. Okay. And that will change depending on where you go. So at a second or third tier, they might have you have a larger teaching component, so where you're in charge of like 2 courses in the spring and 3 in the fall. Now, these may seem like really small numbers, but you have to think about the hours that you're putting in to actually develop the content.
Right, so I can tell you, I have a PhD course right now that's, so we both teach gross anatomy, so that's kind of where we're coming from in our education background. I have a PhD course, it is a total of 120 contact hours for me personally over an entire semester. We meet 2 days a week for lecture and 6 hours a week in lab. That does not include the amount of time that I've had to spend for the past several months developing materials. So even though you're not looking at just, oh, I'm gonna be teaching 2 days a week from Tuesday and Thursday, the amount of effort and administrative workload that you put into these classes is exponential. So even though it's like, oh, I can handle 3 or 4 classes in a semester, that's really overwhelming. That would be overwhelming to me, and I teach quite a bit here. So it's just something to keep in mind. And the reason that we have the teaching course loads per semester is sometimes when you're looking at job ads, they'll specify that specific breakdown, like 2 in the fall, 1 in the spring, something else. Also, if you're teaching labs take up a lot of time. So that's another thing that you're gonna have to factor into there in terms of your overall effort. And that's in conjunction with what else are they expecting you to do your first couple years there? Are they expecting you to pull in extramural funding and do all these grants and then teach 2 courses on top of that? That's gonna be a challenge, and hopefully they're not saying that. But sometimes, depending upon job ads, you have to read in between the lines to figure out what they're asking.
And I think that's a good segue for us to start thinking about what are they asking of me in that position. So what does my time breakdown look like? And we often think about this in a 3-legged stool, is the like classical metaphor, but this stool may not have equal legs. So for instance, the teaching component might be larger than the research component and the service component. And the service component can be in a number of things. For instance, it can be participation in professional societies, or it can be participation in committees on within the campus. So for instance, if I work on the admissions committee to the medical school here, that would be some service. Other good examples of service?
I do so many committees, it's not even funny at this point. I mean, the higher you up you go on, Dean Hall can say the same thing. The more people ask you to do things, the more confident you are, the more they ask you to do things. One of my staff had said that, competency does not go unpunished at GW, which is why I get asked to do a lot of things around here. Mine happens to do with curriculum committees. Mine also has to do with any educational innovation. I was in charge of recently renovating our gross lab, so anything that has to do with those kind of things, I'm always kind of upfront. So it's nice that you're involved. It does take up time. So again, that's kind of the unwritten thing if you're thinking about what are you looking for in a job. When I was finishing, and I got my PhD from Hopkins Med, my advisor had asked me what my ideal breakdown was. I said, oh, I want to do 50% teaching and 50% research. Did not even include service in that little thought because didn't even think about it. So it wasn't even on my radar. But that is an expectation in terms of any faculty positions, and this is how we quantify basically faculty efforts when we're actually doing our year-end faculty reviews. So I quantify every single aspect of my teaching, of my research, and my service. Even though you may really love service, you also need to keep in mind that you don't want to do too much service your first couple years, because that's not necessarily what you're being hired for. Unless you were hired for a service position, you're primarily going to be hired for the teaching or the research aspects of it.
Right. And these will change as you move throughout your career, and I think that's something that we've talked about as well. So for instance, Kirsten's responsibilities in service and admissions has increased over the years, whereas right now mine are pretty low in the service means. In my teaching, it takes up a lot more of my time.
So these percentages continue to change, right? So you don't have to be like, I'm only gonna do this 100% of the time or this 50% of the time. If you're developing in a profession, then you're probably gonna be changing some of your efforts.
Right. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Why don't you guys go ahead and get the food? I see everyone looking hungry. And we'll talk about our food and settles down here. So we're just gonna talk a little bit about our breakdowns and kind of one of the things that we like and we necessarily don't like about our jobs. No job is perfect. I don't care who you talk to. Some people live in this la land where everything's gonna be wonderful and roses. That's not true. So we'll be honest about what we like and what we don't like, and as it relates to kind of our expectations in terms of what we do.
Me first? Okay, so what I really like about my job is, first of all, the colleagues that I work with. I think the work environment is really good here and really collaborative. I also really love being in dissection lab, and which is funny, but also not funny. I really love being in dissection lab, and I really love working with students. So I like the fact that I have a wide breadth of individuals that I work with. I work with med students, graduate students, and undergrads, and I really enjoy that. The only thing I miss is that I don't know all the med students' names, and that's the only thing I don't really like.
We have 185 of them every year.
And it's just really hard to
I don't try. I don't try to learn anybody's name.
Yeah, it's bad though when you see them outside and you're like, hey, you look different than you do in lab.
That's very true. I will say that we probably teach per credit hours more than anybody else within the pre-medical. So pre-medical curriculum is the first 2 years of medical school. We teach extensively. So they see us, they see me probably more than anybody else. I get more feedback than anybody else at this institution as well. And that's because we have labs in addition to all of the content that we cover. So that's one of the things that, that's good about our position as teachers. What do you not like about your job?
What do I not like? I like a lot. So I don't like that I'm not in lab as much as I want to be. Okay, I will say that the one thing that was very surprising to me when I took on the position was the service component. And Dr. Brown kind of alluded to this before. Just like she did during her interview, she asked me what my ideal breakdown was, and I said 80% teaching and 20% research. She laughed at me.
I did.
You did. You laughed at me.
I did.
And I didn't know. I just didn't know that the service was such a big component. But it is important because it's like university. We all have to work together to make our university better. So I'm learning more about that service component, and doing stuff like this helps contribute to the university as a whole and making our institution an excellent one. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. Please ask questions.
Okay, so for not necessarily the service, but the research and teaching breakdown, is that something you negotiate yourself where it kind of comes naturally as you go?
So that depends a lot on the teaching. So if you're being hired as a teaching position, there's going to be an expectation of things that you do. With that said, any position is going to expect you to fulfill basically three parts of your stool. Now, if you're coming into a position and you're like, I'm going to be teaching all of these labs, I'm not going to be able to negotiate a wet lab space for myself, but maybe I can negotiate other things. So it really depends upon what they're looking for. Every place I've ever interviewed, there was always an expectation of research, and so there are ways that you can kind of make it work for you. Whether that ends up being one of the faculty members we just hired is going to be working and collaborating in somebody else's lab because his position did not include a lab, nor did he want his own lab. So it really depends upon what you're looking for.
And for our type of research, we do a lot of educational research, so developing new technologies, developing new ways to get the content out, also evaluating like gender biases in publications is something Dr. Brown is working on. So it's like there are different ways to have like a research component without having a wet lab and running extensive experiments. Does that make sense?
So I guess I'm saying, is this something that's kind of in the job posting?
The job posting
Or-
will be specific about what you are expected to do under kind of like you're expected to teach this much. Whatever is left is kind of what you're gonna be able to do. So if you know that you wanna do some more extensive research, but you're gonna be saddled with a 4-4 teaching load, that's not a good fit that would be for you.
We would wanna look for something a
Yeah.
little more.
So if like the graphs that you're showing, like 50% teaching, so I don't think you would be able to write a grant and do something, right?
No.
So you're just only collaborating with people and doing their stuff.
Right. So, yeah, it's gonna be difficult. You start to get on that, and again, teaching intensive positions, there's a lot of variability. I will say we have different faculty here who are tenured or tenure track positions, and they do a lot of teaching. There are some who are tenure track positions, they don't do very much teaching at all. So you do get a wide range of options. Ultimately, if the institution is looking for maybe an educator, the institution is not gonna care that I'm trying to bring in all this grant money. They're like, are you covering the labs? Because that's what we hired you for. But if that's something that you know you wanna do, then you may be able to find a position that's somewhere in the middle. But it's very hard to do any type of that research. And Katie came from a more basic science wet lab background and came over here and transitioned, and so now we end up working on different educational projects.
But I had to find a way to make that transition. I had to build my educational research and my education portfolio in order to make that transition. And we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll also talk about looking at job ads and recognizing verbiage within them to be like, okay, I know my teaching component is gonna be really large in this versus, okay, my teaching component is gonna be very small. And there are like keywords that you can kind of pick out for that.
So for my efforts, so I started out heavy teaching, and then now I've taken on more of a service heavy load just because of my involvement in our curriculum. We revised our medical curriculum a couple of years ago. I'm one of the major course directors. I'm in charge of all the gross anatomy content, so anything that happens, I have to know about it because I have to logistically and vertically plan it. That's a lot of work, so my service component is a little bit higher on that end. My research component is quantified as 10%, which looks sad sometimes, I'll be honest. But that ends up being kind of at my end of the year faculty report, am I keeping all of basically the stools, am I meeting all my expectations? Now with that said, I've managed to be a co-PI on a couple grants this year, one for virtual reality, which is an education-based initiative. Katie and I got a grant from the Shankman Services to do career seminars like this, several publications every year. So it's not that I'm not doing research, but that is not my primary focus here. So I have to get a little creative with how I'm gonna do all of these things, because as I said, I basically have 1.5 days a week where I'm strict teaching. So that kind of falls out. And one of the things I can tell you is a teaching position, one of the things, I love my job, I love teaching, I love being in charge. One of the things I don't like is our schedule. So in the medical school, this is different from other institutions, where if you're at maybe Columbia College or the engineering school across the street, their spring break is 1 week, and then it's like, summer is usually, everyone thinks it's like the time off. My future in-laws always ask me if I'm working over the summer, and I was like, I'm always working over the summer. I'm like, just because I'm a teacher doesn't mean I'm not. With the medical school, our schedule is so different. So I teach from August, like beginning of August, before anybody comes back to campus, because the med students start early. I go up until December, we start again January 2nd, I'm going all the way to May. And then in the summer, I get ready for the fall. So I can't just leave in the middle of the year and go to Sweden or go on vacation. I have commitments to be in lab. So again, and over several years, I've structured kind of how to make that work, because we teach in so many different curricula. We're not just teaching med students, we're teaching all of these other different populations. That's one thing I didn't intend when I got hired, is kind of this balance. The balance is definitely more challenging as we've revised our curriculum. So in terms of your own time frame, that's something to keep in mind. What specifically are the dates of the year that you're looking at?
Okay, so now I wanna get us to start thinking about how do we begin the job search. And this may seem really basic, but it's important to know where to even begin. So some search engines we can use to look for positions are things like higher ed jobs, and there's Chronicle Vitae. What was the other one you talked about?
Chronicle, higher. Well, that is Chronicle of Higher Education.
No, there's another one, I can't remember.
There's a bunch of different job posting websites.
And of course, there's these professional
Organizations.
Thank you, Jesus, my words. Professional organizations that you can also use to look for job postings. For instance, I'm a member of American Association of Anatomists, and they have a specific job posting site. I'm pretty sure APS does as well, and I do know that the American Association for Cancer Research does. And these are kind of associations we're associated with these because I have some neuroscience training and I'm an anatomist as well. But there's also the basic science kind of route you can look into.
So any of the professional organizations where you're going to yearly meetings or like regional meetings and presenting things, they usually have job posting boards. And their job posting boards will be for a range of different things. Education focused, postdocs, there'll be research opportunities. Sometimes we see things on ours just because we're in Washington DC in terms of public policy postings because of the background of the people that are in there. So you really need to start thinking, kind of casting a wide net and looking at all these different options. When I was in charge of the search committee, we cross-posted at multiple places, so we didn't just post at one. We cross-posted at the American Association of Anatomists, I posted at the American Association of Clinical Anatomists, we posted on Chronicle of Higher Education. We also, again, informal word is another way that you guys can actually find out a lot of information. So anybody that I knew within my professional circle, I let them know that we were hiring people. So a lot of times informal word, especially because things will not officially be available, but the word on the street is someone's looking for somebody. So when you go to the meetings, the networking is really critical in terms of identifying some of those jobs.
I have seen people put like, I'm graduating soon, poster on their posters. So like their poster, and then they'll have like a little pronounced like, hey, I'm going to be an anatomist soon and I'm looking for a job. So that's something to consider. I've never done it before. But when we do begin our search, we want to think back to what we discussed a little bit earlier, what type of institution do you want to work at? Because that will help really dictate your faculty breakdown. And so smaller workers, undergrad, or graduates. And we always want to think about who we're talking to when we start these job searches. And that's the search committee. And so Dr. Brown talked a little bit about running a search committee and what exactly is that. So a search committee is essentially just a group of people. There's usually 3 faculty members on it, 3 or 4.
Depends upon the position.
That have been commissioned by the chair to fill a void within the department. So for instance, when I got hired here, there were 3 people.
And a chair, so there was 4.
There was 4. There was 4 people on the search committee. And I had to appeal to them with my cover letter and my teaching portfolio to get an interview.
And kind of the way that the search committee first is, even though the entire department, even though say our department would be involved in hiring somebody, your search committee is basically that first stop that's gonna look at all of the applications. I can tell you we probably had something like over 100 applications for like one job. So out of 100 of those, everybody has a cover letter, they all put their CV on there, and they're all putting statement of teaching philosophy statements. So that's like 10 pages per person, all of these PDFs that we bundle. The search committee then will review every single applicant, which is why your cover letter and how you're addressing them is so important, because we do not have a lot of time to waste 10 minutes on every person. There's not physically that much time to do that. And then from there, then we end up selecting top candidates that we will then usually do either a phone interview or a physical interview for. So you're slowly narrowing down basically from a bigger pool to a smaller pool to then end up doing the interviews and hopefully getting a job offer. So there's a lot of back work that the committees do in terms of what we look for. And then when we're looking at CVs, the cover letter and everything else to see, first of all, did you read our ad correctly? You'd be surprised how many people don't actually read an ad correctly and just email everybody. And even though you have no qualifications whatsoever for the job that we posted. And then can you also be a good fit for the department or for the institution that we're looking for? So it's really critical to put a lot of effort into the cover letter and then also into all of these documents in order to get the attention of the search committee, because you only have basically one shot for that first impression. Yeah.
So what kind of keywords or what kind of words do you really look in the CV or in the cover letter so that you can have a feel of the application?
We will be covering that.
We'll talk about that. That's a great time.
We have an example of a
Yeah.
ad, ad and how we would construct the cover letter based on what they're looking for.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll have, it's not just words, it's also experiences.
No, what I mean to say is like, as you mentioned, you don't have so much time to kind of scrutinize each application word by word. So you quickly probably go through this application. So what is that catches your eye to make it as a potential applicant?
First of all, whether you actually have the teaching experience. I can tell you several, again, in the last 2 committees that I've served on, people applying for a job and they just say, oh, anatomy and regenerative biology. They do all of this amazing research and they spent like a page talking about, oh, their awesome research program. And there was literally nothing about how you were gonna teach. That was like a throwaway. It looked exactly like they took that cover letter and had applied to multiple jobs. So that was not structured to our ad whatsoever. So that one we just kind of ignore. And even if maybe they did have teaching experience, but if you're coming with your foot and presenting that first, that's not really gonna be meeting what we need for our goals. So you have to direct it in terms of the specific verbiage that the cover letter is, that the ad is asking, and then construct your cover letter based on, I have this experience, I have this, I have this, I have this, I have this.
For matching out your qualifications to an ad, I feel like there's no perfect fit. So what kind of threshold do you think you should hit with your qualifications before you decide I can apply for this?
We talk a little bit about this when we look at an ad, but so for instance, like the ad we have pulled up later, it's the ability to teach embryo, histo, neuro, and gross anatomy. Like that's really hard to be an expert in all of those things. And normally, like just in general, females will be like, okay, I don't fit all these things, I can't apply for it. Or I don't have as much research or teaching experience as they ask for, I can't apply for it. What you need to do is you need to sell what you do have. So, for instance, when I applied for this position here, I had not very much didactic lecture experience. I didn't have a lot of experience working with small groups or this like active learning style, but instead of focusing on those things and saying those things, I said what I did have. And I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but basically, like 80% of what the job ad is asking for is like my rule of thumb.
We're hold those questions because we're actually gonna get to an example where you can see that.
Okay, so the search committee will be the one that's filtering through the ad, and you can tell what the ad is asking for based on some like of these verbiages or key phrases and words. So for instance, if you're looking for a research-focused job, they'll often mention something about startup funds. They'll ask candidates often to come in with external funding, and they'll look for candidates that will fit within their collaborative environment. So research that will build on top of research that's already occurring in the university, which makes sense.
They'll also ask, instead, like in a research position, they won't necessarily ask you for a teaching philosophy statement, they're gonna ask you for a research statement.
They'll ask
So what is your program, what are you doing? And then they may actually, if they're academic positions, they're faculty positions, they're probably gonna want you to have 2 to 3 years of postdoc experience or something. So that's one type of the jobs on that one side. Teaching jobs, on the other hand, they're gonna be very explicit where they're gonna say, we want you to participate in courses, they're gonna list either courses or they're gonna list the student populations you're working with. They're gonna specify somewhat about the responsibilities that you're doing that. They may ask you to get involved in curriculum development. And then usually we'll say something about service to university and then also collaborative development of different areas within the teaching faculty there. You can also go to the websites, the institution websites, and a lot of them now, at least in the medical side, you end up having the teaching focused faculty, and so there's kind of a clarification that we're teaching focused, either in the biography or the way things are laid out, or the ones that are research focused. So you can kind of see what the interests and what the people are doing at the institution. Again, even though it's not the focus of research, they will mention something about educational research or scholarship. So there's an expectation that you do have scholarship even if you are in a teaching intensive position, especially if you're gonna be at 4-year colleges like GW or even higher.
So when they say graduate and undergraduate responsibilities, I've seen that in job ads before, and if I didn't see it in the teaching position column now, I would have thought like, oh, graduate responsibilities. I'm gonna have graduate students in my lab and I'm gonna be mentoring them and blah, blah, blah.
So that could be what it means. It could also mean that you're teaching graduate students.
Okay.
So it's a lot of, and again, we're coming from an area where you're teaching medical students, and we also, in our job ads, we specify graduate students in these programs. So it could go either way.
I think that the research positions would be like mentoring graduate students. Just that one word throws it off.
Yeah, neither Katie or I have graduate students. Like,
Right.
we don't have, they're not we work on projects with them, we mentor them, but they are not their primary advisors are not us.
That
Which
was
is good, cause I
mainly-
wouldn't have time.
Right, me either. That was mainly just saying those are the type of populations of students you'd be working with. So responsibilities in the graduate and undergraduate curriculum. So the mentoring is what really sets that apart.
And here's the thing, it's very different to teach an undergraduate student population versus a graduate student population versus PA, physician's assistants versus medical students.
Yeah, it really is.
Completely different ballgame. And one of the things we looked for is we wanted to see people that specifically had experience in medical teaching. The expectation that we have for medical teaching is different than if we have someone that does undergraduate teaching. So we were explicit when we applied and we put the job ad out that we wanted someone that had worked with this student population before.
Because they will be at a different level for sure. I've now worked with medical students, grad and undergrads. And in the current course that I'm teaching, it's a grad and undergrad course, but I use some of my material that I developed with medical students. And I try to change it a little bit, but I realize that I haven't changed it enough because it's all very, very clinical.
Yeah.
So getting used to tailoring your work to each population is it's a learning process for me and just something you have to be aware of. Okay, other key components you want to look for in your job advertisement that are pretty, similar between both research and teaching. But do they specify if it's a tenure or contract based position? Tenure teaching faculty positions are like unicorns these days.
They're chupacabras. There's only ever a couple, and that's primarily, at least again, in the medical side, if we're teaching faculty, we're usually non-tenure track or contract-based positions. And that's also specified for reference, if you're ever looking at positions, that's specified in I have a separate promotion and tenure or promotion guideline because of my position compared to a tenure track faculty at this institution. So there's different expectations for us based on that.
Some will also require different degrees. For instance, if you're working for a PT school, they often require you to have a doctorate in physical therapy. And then they'll do the amount of experience requested, and that gets back to how much experience is enough. And they'll usually do a breakdown of responsibilities, and you just want to think back to our pie chart and where you want to be in 5 years. And you also want to think about the start dates.
Are there any jobs where they take people without any experience for the starters?
If it's like an assistant professor faculty position, likely no, but sometimes you can end up in maybe a lecturer position. Another thing would be think about if there would be time for adjuncting, like a course which by no means should anybody stay in adjunct forever. That's one we love them, they teach in the lab with us, but that's not their primary thing. That's one way to get some teaching experience, because it's gonna be hard if you don't have any teaching experience to apply for these types of jobs. So again, you might have to get a little bit creative with that.
And are there any courses, because I came from India, so I have done all my studies back in India, so I don't know how it works here. So do I need to have some courses or something, so before I can apply for anything, because the curriculum and the way of teaching everywhere is different, right? So
Right, so that's also what you can, again, but that's where you start to sell yourself in a cover letter, just because you came, and you just have to explain, that the approach that you use is based kind of on these principles, and it comes from this approach, so maybe it's not didactic lecture.
Okay, so I think that's a great segue for how much experience is enough experience. And just to use myself as an example, as I was kind of explaining earlier, you won't know until you try, honestly. Like when I applied for GW, I didn't realize that I was not even gonna be done for the start date because I did not see the start date, which was very embarrassing now I think back on it, but it turned out okay. I also had a lot of gaps, but rather than focusing on my gaps, I focused on things that I did have. I had a lot of cadaveric dissection. I had neuroanatomy training, and I worked on some neuroanatomy small group cases, although it wasn't a huge component. And then I obviously also had my PhD research, which was 5 years of stuff. And then finally, I had this very small educational research that I had going for me, and I had 2 small projects that I was working on. And although they were small and they didn't take up a huge time in my education, they set me apart enough to give me a little bit of a push on the educational research. I had just gotten my feet wet in those things to understand that research on that side was vastly different than the research on the wet lab side.
And and we don't have the job ad for when Katie applied, but I can tell you it was a position that was looking for gross anatomy and neuroanatomy experience at the medical level. So when I saw her ad, I said, great, taught dissection, she has neuroanatomy experience, she had PhD research which was related to that, she'd also done a little bit of this. Again, when I got hired at GW, I didn't have any lecture experience and they still hired me. They basically took a chance on me and they're like, well, you're cheap, so we'll see how it works out. I think it worked out okay for them. But she had a lot more even based on that. So the way she presented herself was well above many of the other applicants based on that cover letter.
Right. And it's how I structured the cover letter,
and we're not expecting everybody to come in with every single check mark. That's great if they are. But we're expecting enough of the background to fill the gaps that we need on this side. We needed somebody to be in the lab and we needed someone to teach these two areas.
So like I went straight from my PhD to a faculty position rather than doing a postdoc 15. So
I did the same.
You get that. Okay, so that brings us.
One comment?
Yeah.
So, as our previous medical, they're talking about a very specific teaching job at a medical school. It's a relatively unusual thing to be teaching in anatomy and embryology and so forth. Every medical school needs them, but they don't need a biochemistry teacher, for example. But for many of you who are postdocs and thinking about how to get teaching experience, one really rich place to do that is community colleges. And you can teach at night, and you can take a section, and they're always looking for good people. And you might be teaching straight chemistry or something that's in your wheelhouse, but less focused than this, and gaining teaching experience, because you just set up a class, you run a class, you get exam experience. So it's a good way to do it if you're thinking, if you will, late in the game, oh my gosh, how am I gonna get enough experience to compete effectively for a 4-year college or university job?
We specifically chose these careers because this appealed to us. We had extensive training in our PhD for this type of training. It's a very kind of weird segue. For many of you guys, you're probably not doing nearly as much teaching as either one of us did when we were in undergraduate. So again, you guys are gonna have to be a little bit more creative in how you try to get some of this teaching experience.
I will echo what Dean Hall was saying. One of my educational mentors, she taught while she was in graduate school at a small community college at like night classes. So it's something you can do as long as her research wasn't failing and she could do whatever she wanted.
And they always need people.
Yeah, they do. So it can be done and it has been done and it is used. It's real life. Okay. So application documents, things we need to start pulling together for those job advertisements. I will say that we're going to focus on 3 things: the cover letter, the teaching evals, and then we'll briefly talk about teaching philosophy. You could literally have an entire workshop on probably each one of these things, but we just want to introduce these because they are essential for teaching positions. Okay. So the cover letter, this is what you're going to be submitting to that search committee. So the search committee that's been commissioned by the chair. So this is your first shot to catch their eye. You want to be formal, but you don't want to be like a little robot like our little stormtrooper here. And you want to think about how it's all going to fit together.
And you will have to write a different one for every institution that you apply for. Do not use the same one every single time. Likely part of it will be similar, that's to be expected, but it shouldn't be the exact same one for every institution because again, the cover letter is going to dictate, the ad will dictate what you say.
Yeah.
And we can tell if you sent me a cover letter that you wrote for something else. Yes.
You always want to, and the one way you can really make that connection with university is by echoing, skipping everything up there, is by echoing their mission. So like George Washington has a mission statement that I looked up when I first started applying here. And this is a very abbreviated version of it. I took out like basically what I honed in on. And you can use that as a good way to like really connect with that university. You also want to look at the department that you're applying to. So the faculty members, what kind of research they're doing, if they're involved in educational research, and try to see how you would fit in that department. If you're not going to be a fit, if you're going to be a lone wolf,
That's what I like to say,
a lone wolf, maybe that's not the best institution for you.
Lone wolf is basic, and this again, because we're in a very specific subfield, I have friends that have ended up in institutions where they're the only person doing that research. They're the only ones who are doing X, and everybody else, so again, they're lone wolfing. It's a challenge because a lot of what science is moving toward is team science and collaborative science, and I think you guys all know that. It's hard to basically be your own person with your own program, but then you're not having any connections and you don't have any collaborations with anybody else in the institution. So you guys will notice at GW here, we have different institutes and different centers because we're recruiting faculty that kind of fit into these different areas. So when we were recruiting faculty, we were interested in people that would fit in with the current people of the department. Because it's gonna make your professional development a whole lot easier if you have other people who are interested in a similar field.
So these are all tactics that you can use to make yourself like have the search committee see you in that institution as well. So you want to make sure you address the person leading the search committee. It's usually listed on the ad. You want to highlight the research and education that is most notable in your career, and then see how you align with that university as well. And you can do all of that easily in the cover letter.
So the components of a cover letter, in the links on the slides, there's a website called the Professor's Inn, and she does professional development for PhD students in all fields in terms of writing CVs, writing cover letters, writing all these things. She's very, very good at kind of basically cutting through the BS, I would say, in terms of how are you gonna structure cover letters. And so for those of you guys who really like a very structured way to address something, her suggestion was to basically do your very brief intro paragraph, where you just basically say, hello, search committee and chair, this is my name, where you saw the application or where you saw the ad and what you're doing. So it should be very short. She then suggests that you basically delve into a research paragraph where you're talking about the type of research you do currently and kind of what it means, for the field and what kind of connections you're making. She then breaks it down to a publications paragraph, so how the research has transitioned to knowledge that's been disseminated. This would also include presentations and other things. She then has a second project paragraph, which is basically where you say what you're gonna do next. So you're doing this now, but what's your next step? What do you wanna do, where do you go? And then her final one was a teaching paragraph, where you talk about basically what you've done in teaching and, kind of your responsibilities. Katie and I both agreed that if it is a teaching job, that you probably wanna flip that script. I don't wanna wade through 4 paragraphs of your research program if I'm trying to find somebody that's gonna teach physiology to medical students. But it's a good outline. Now, I can tell you for me, when I'm thinking about a cover letter for a job, and mine are all gonna be education-based jobs if I would apply for a job, I would do the teaching paragraph, and then my research ends up being a segue into that. Because I'm basically setting up my career as an educator, and all of my research interests are aligned to that. So I have a natural transition in that. So it's just a way to think about structuring the cover letter in terms of how you're catching their eye. Now, if it was a research position, then obviously you're gonna want the cover letter to address the research aspects. You're also then gonna have a research statement where you get into more detail in terms of those things. But this is basically your first option for me to spend less than a minute trying to figure out if we're even gonna put you on a list to put you in the pool for bringing you in. So it goes quick, so you need to be high profile and highlight your strengths. I can tell you, so this student, Lawrence, is one of my TAs currently, and he's actually giving a couple lectures in one of my graduate courses, and I know he wants to have a teaching position, and I told him, I was like, you need to start getting a teaching dossier ready, which means we need evaluations for you. So he has some from what else he's done. We also came up with an evaluation for him, so at the end of his session, we will hand it out and we'll collect that data. So if you're ever in this process where, you're giving even like a lecture or something or one thing, you can always come with your own evaluation, and there's nothing wrong with asking those students to fill it out, because you're gonna wanna put it in there, in that teaching dossier. And I told Lawrence, we need to start adding to these things, especially if you're teaching, you need to be able to document it. And a lot of times that ends up falling by the wayside if you're not a faculty member where we're evaluated regularly. If you're doing teaching anytime you're doing teaching, whatever it is, keep in mind that you wanna have something in the back of your palm that you can get them to evaluate you for.
And as I mentioned, you don't want just student evaluations, but ideally you can get peer evaluations. So this should be someone that's in the department, in your department that relatively knows the material that you're conveying, and then will sit in and give you feedback. One of the senior faculty members in my department has offered to sit in on my courses currently and watch my lecture style and give me feedback, which I appreciate. And Dr. Brown has sat in on two of mine so far in the fall, so that's always, it's really helpful as the growth of an educator, but it's also helpful whenever you're going to apply for it.
And peer evaluations are different than student evaluations. Student evaluations, sometimes they're really harsh, sometimes they had a bad day. So the peer evaluation is coming from somebody with more of a background and hopefully somebody that has more of an experience in teaching so they can speak more to kind of the overall concept. A lot of times students are like, did you like it? Were you happy? How did it go? So you want to be able to balance it out and be able to address yes, the evaluations may have been on the lower side, but it was an effective session, and there's a lot of things that go into why students do not the evaluations and all of that goes into it, so.
Alright, so the last thing we'll talk about document-wise today is the teaching philosophy. And this teaching philosophy or teaching statement is actually pretty important. the majority of academic positions, teaching positions, will ask for a teaching philosophy. And this is basically your statement of beliefs on how you think teaching should go, like how you should be as an educator. So for me, like, I want to be knowledgeable and fair but firm, but also approachable. So these are like the three things that I hone in on as an educator. I want to know my stuff. I want to be able to convey it clearly, tell you when you're wrong, but be fair about it and nice about it, and also be approachable.
As examples of teaching philosophy statements, so, you know, and the Professors In website actually has a lot of good tips on this specifically, which we've linked in the slides. One of the things is like, people are like, oh, I want to develop critical thinking skills in students. What does that mean? That literally means nothing to me. So you need to come up and basically show evidence of how you were able to demonstrate them develop critical thinking skills. So it's not enough that you're using these like, you know, buzzwords. You need to be able to say, this is a teaching approach and describe it, and then how that actually contributed to the overall process. So, and again, you don't want to be like, I like to flip classrooms, which is a teaching approach. Well, how exactly did that work out, and what was the end result? Is there feedback? Are there evaluations based on these that would suggest that it was an effective teaching mechanism? So again, writing these, you're always going to feel, and I still feel like this, it's always like, kind of, woo, you're just trying to like do all this. It sounds insincere no matter, for me, no matter when I write them. But as you go through multiple drafts, you start to hone in on specific examples. And so likely some of the specific examples, these should also be reflected in your CV. And then also a lot of times committees will ask you for examples of your teaching documents. So a syllabus. If you did a community college and you gave a biochemistry, instructed a biochemistry class at community college, you would have to develop a syllabus, you would have to develop assessments, you would then have to actually walk through how you actually thought about this whole process of teaching. So that's where, again, kind of the experience should be reflected in the cover letter and also in the teaching philosophy statement.
Yeah, and this is something that will, it's very amorphous, it will change and grow over time as you grow as an educator. And I think that's why it's really important that you give examples of how your teaching style changes and how you've implemented specific styles and how they work well, or how hopefully how they always work well. Okay, so we pulled an example of a job posting from the American Association of Anatomists website, so something geared towards us. And we just wanted to highlight some of the verbiage that kind of jumps out at us, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we go about constructing a cover letter for this. Because things like a teaching philosophy is something that will go with you to every job posting, but cover letters change.
So for this one, the first thing I saw when I saw this, I was like, this is a tenure track teaching position. This is the chupacabra of teaching positions in anatomy, basically. That very rarely ever happens. The second thing I saw that they wanted you to have a particular background, a particular degree. Sometimes they'll say ABD, which means you're not finished, but they're willing to look at you as an applicant. Strong background and demonstrated excellence in teaching of these subset fields. So strong background, which means that you've actually taught them, demonstrated excellence, which is going to tie into the teaching evaluations. From there, they basically go down that they want you to demonstrate skills in developing innovative teaching methods, and then they talk about educational scholarship and graduate and professional students. Nowhere in there did they really ask me anything about what the research program was going to be. They just said it would be highly desirable if you fit into what everybody else did. So when I was constructing this cover letter, again, teaching, basically, this background would be first. Then I would talk about innovation that I've done in teaching, and then I would get into scholarship after the fact. So that's how, again, when we're looking for the cover letter, you want to think about it how they're basically listing it in there. So you go from point B to point C to point D. If it was a physiology or biochemistry posting, they would probably say something similar. A lot of them, if you're in education, they'll mention something about, again, curriculum development or scholarship or something else. So, but do you guys see how like the way they said it is like when I'm reading that, like what I'm looking for, I'm not looking for 5 pages on your research statement. It's a different subset of skills that we're looking for.
Yeah, so teaching should be the first thing that you definitely have in the cover letter. Right. And then they go on to tell you how great Omaha is, and then at the bottom they have a list of the documents that you would need when you apply. And maybe you guys cannot see that. But it's really important that you submit every single one of these. Can I reiterate that now? So the CV, brief teaching dossier, and then
And hopefully they just ask you for contact information, because I've been I've written letters for people where it was the part of the HR system that actually sent you an email the minute I had a student apply for a job and they wanted the contact letter, even though there was no guarantee that they were gonna be anywhere on that list. For us, we basically went through, got down to the top pool that we were interested in, and then we asked for contact letters. There's no point for me to email your advisors for a contact letter if you guys are not in the top pool. And those are gonna take a couple weeks to come in, right? We're realistic in that we are basically trying to interview people and get the reference letters at the same time. My only suggestion, if you have to get a reference letter, give your advisors or mentor a couple weeks' notice. What'd you say?
Draft it yourself.
Oh.
And then provide it to your advisor.
Dean all has a different visit.
It will
I say-
highlight your accomplishments.
Yeah, I can tell you that and some of the PhD students, and if you guys are thinking about applying for if you end up applying for a lot of jobs, one of our students, Kate, basically sent me a document with a copy of the job ad, what they were looking for, how she thought her skills were tied into that, anything else she wanted to say, and the due date. She did all the dummy work for me. I didn't have to do anything except talk about how awesome she was as an instructor. So anything that you can make it easier on us, we are very appreciative to that. And the cover letter, the job ad is essential because job ads are gonna differ between institutions, so I wanna know what I'm saying to you. I can't write the same one necessarily, yeah. Yeah, and I think just overall, if you're thinking about marketability, again, I always feel like we come from a very teaching heavy background, so we're kind of weirdos in the school in terms of everything we've done. When you're actually thinking about organizing anything for a CV even, I think, and this would be basically, you can highlight little bits of these from the CV in your cover letter or in your teaching philosophy. You don't need to list every single thing you did. If I listed every single thing I taught here, that would be a 50 million page cover letter. So I basically pick out a couple of them, but if the more specific you are in your CV, that's helpful. Like, what lectures have you given? Basically, the title, what the students, and then what the student population is, because that's one thing that we're gonna be interested in, is you're talking undergraduates, you're talking graduate students, kind of the time frame, was this like 5 years ago? Any teaching assistant experience, you guys have any opportunities to TA, any labs or anything, no matter how small it is, definitely document it. My TA is TA for a couple different courses. And then also, again, even if you're not just like a TA just basically shows up and does X, but maybe your TA position or maybe your teaching position, you actually did more than that. So I use my TAs much more extensively, and I actually have them write exam questions with me, and we actually do quite a bit of development on that aspect. So I don't just expect them to show up, they're actually integral in terms of the whole process. So you wanna be as specific as you can, and as Katie was saying, you're not gonna fit 100% of the qualifications on the job ad, but apply anyway and sell yourself. You wanna be realistic that you're applying for a job, and again, you need to keep an open communication with your mentors and your advisors in terms of applying for these positions. You don't wanna just be like, hey, I'm thinking about applying here, or, hopefully they're invested in your professional development and seeing where you're gonna end up. And so again, it kinda has to go down through a checklist. Do you think you can meet some of these? I will tell you, when I applied for the job at GW, I didn't think I had a chance in hell to get this job. And it was actually an internal hire, which I didn't know. They interviewed me and they liked me so much they hired me. And I didn't meet 100% of the qualifications, but I was able to sell myself in the letter so that they actually took a chance on me, and they liked what I had put in my cover letter, and they liked all of my experiences, why they took me. Because I was finishing my PhD like Katie was. So I didn't have postdoc experience or anything, but I was able to sell myself based on that. Yeah.
What about mentoring undergraduate students just through research?
Right, that's great. So if you're gonna do that, which obviously you're doing that, you can also talk about, because again, start the teaching philosophy statements, how that is an example of teaching, because mentoring and teaching kind of goes along the same way. You do want to have more specific examples of basically formalized teaching. So that would be more informal teaching. Formal teaching would be basically in front of a class.
But is that something you still want to list, honestly?
Sure, why not?
Yeah, for sure. I would for sure do it.
Yeah, what's right, and again, I've seen people that actually, and again, because you're coming from basically a PhD, you're gonna have to kind of construct it in a way that's basically, if you're talking about mentoring students, I would call that small group.
Yeah, it's all about how you couch it.
Yeah.
Where you put it, how you couch it. Okay, I think that's all we have for you guys today. The biggest take-home message from us is that you want to be proactive. You want to start looking at job ads and seeing what they do require of you, and then figure out ways that you can, finagle your way into getting those experiences. So there's no harm in going to professional sites and looking at their job postings to see what they do require.
And I think the other thing is to start early. I can tell you, I waited till the last year of my PhD and ended up finding stuff, but I think especially for you guys, if you're interested in teaching positions, and you're gonna have to start to figure out how you're gonna get some teaching experience. So maybe that means you need to work in some agreements with your advisors and your mentors in terms of, hey, would it be okay if I TA'd this course? Or could I go ahead and do this one course, maybe a summer course at a community college or something? And so you're gonna wanna be able to start to think about those so that you're actually preparing yourself to be effective and capable on the job market. Because somebody else is probably already doing that, and then you're gonna be up in the same position. So again, it requires a little bit of planning in terms of figuring out how to put all of the pieces together.
Do you have any questions for us?
And I think we have all the slides. Laura, you have the slides, we're gonna share them? Okay.
Yes, I just gave them to her.
Okay, so and the slides, in the notes on the slides, we have a lot of links to different websites, like the one I was talking about, the professor is in terms of drafting cover letters and everything else.
And I think our email there. Feel free to, I mean, you can contact me if you want to and ask, like, pick my brain. I don't know, I'm sure after.
I don't mind. Give me 24 hours to respond. That's my general rule of thumb.
Okay, well, thanks, guys.
We'll be around for a little bit if you guys wanna ask us questions or anything. Or if you wanna get more pizza, if you only came here for food.
I just wanna ask you to also sign in if you haven't done so already. I think the form's up front.